Right now, as the sequester takes hold, has President Obama been forced to change his tune? We're not hearing so much about the sequester apocalypse. We'll be talking as to why. And next, what can the grand old party learn from Mitt Romney's defeat? Well, he spoke out this weekend about why he thinks the election slipped through his fingers. And later, Cardinals from around the globe, they're descending on Rome for the conclave. We'll have what the Cardinals might be talking about behind closed doors. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French, and thanks so much for joining us this Monday evening, March 4th. Well, it happened. Despite all the warnings of economic doom, despite all the complaints from voters, and despite all the poll numbers that universally tell lawmakers to do whatever it takes to prevent the sequester, as expected, the sequester happened. The cuts took effect early Saturday morning. And for the latest, let's start off with our senior political correspondent, Andrew Whitman.
Well, Rich, let's start with the impacts of the sequester cuts, and there are some to report already, though for many people and many services, it will take more time to feel the sting if that sting is to be felt. First, the White House and Pentagon deciding not to send the aircraft carrier, the USS Harry Truman, to the Middle East, a decision that they say is directly linked to the sequester. Both the White House and Pentagon taking pains to point out there's currently another carrier group in the region. Other impacts, the Army announcing it'll begin cutting back training for 80% of its soldiers. Again, they say the sequester is to blame. As many as 11 air traffic control towers near Los Angeles preparing for possible closures if sequester cuts demand them. And while most air travel operated normally today, the first business travel day since the sequester kicked in, there were two notable exceptions, and one of them happened right here in New York. Customs and Border Protection announcing that 56 flights out of JFK were delayed by 2 hours or more today, and 14 flights were delayed by at least 3 hours because of sequester cuts that forced staffing cutbacks at security and customs booths. Lower staffing means fewer screenings. That means slower movement on and off of flights. But the worst of the cuts could still be weeks away. More than 1 million federal employees face potential furloughs beginning next month. Those workers are union members. Union rules require a month's notice before any furloughs. That notice has now been given. Biggest impact could be in Virginia, where a huge percentage of the workforce works for Uncle Sam. Projections are, in some quarters, the sequester could throw Virginia into recession and do it relatively quickly. But with so much of the pain from sequester yet to show up on the evening news, President Obama seems to be changing his approach. Here's the president on Friday.
This is not going to be a apocalypse, I think, as some people have said. It's just dumb.
Only if you check the president's earlier statements, the president may have been one of those voices calling the sequester something of a fiscal apocalypse.
Changes like this, not well thought through, not phased in properly, changes like this affect our ability to respond to threats in unstable parts of the world. So these cuts are not smart, they are not fair, they will hurt our economy, they will add hundreds of thousands of Americans to the unemployment rolls. This is not an abstraction. People will lose their jobs.
Slight change of tone from the president there. So how, when, and does the nation get out of the sequester mess? That's what NBC asked one of the key players in sequester talk Sunday, House Speaker John Boehner.
You don't really see a pathway here that's open as you sit here.
If I did, the meeting at the White House this morning might have gone better.
So if John Boehner doesn't see a way out of this, and he's one of the guys at the table, Rich, don't know how much hope that should give the rest of us.
All right, we'll talk about Endgame in a minute here. Let's bring in our panel for this conversation. Jessica Proud, Republican strategist and Vice President, NLO Strategies. Dominic Carter, riding shotgun tour, political journalist and author. And Ned Lamont joining us, Chairman of Lamont Digital Systems. And you remember him from the political world, former Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate from the terrific state of Connecticut. Thank you guys very much. All right, month from now, Brother Dominic, how does this play out? Are we going to say how bad the cuts were? Will it be worse than some people think it is? Will it be not as bad? Talk about the pain aspect first.
Well, maybe I'm not seeing things clearly, but I don't see any difference in what the president said in his prior warning and what he said just the other day. He warned that these cuts are to come, that they're not smart, you know, it's going to hurt. If you live in the state of Virginia, it's going to hurt tremendously. And I really believe it's going to hurt all Americans. But it's going to take time. And I mean, it's not something that we want to happen. I don't want to see Americans hurt or any other family hurt, but it's coming.
Jessica, do you think it's going to be very painful, or it's going to be 30 days from now, it's going to be like, what was all this fear and worry here, Mr. President. Yeah, it wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't so bad.
Well, let's just start out with the first premise of this, was that this was President and Congress's idea to put this into place. Number one. And number two, they're now coming and warning against this, apocalyptic outcome, which we're realizing is not actually the case. I think everyone can agree that using the sequester as a way to budget is bad policy. But we can also agree that there needs to be spending cuts. So if they are ready to get serious about entitlement reform that will actually make a difference into tackling the deficit, then I think they can get somewhere. But it is going to be painful, and it is a dumb way to policy.
But Ned, you just heard the rub right there. I heard about entitlement reform. And the president seems willing to put on the table and talk about Medicare. And practical people soberly says, and you're a businessman, you do the math here, there has to be something. This has got to give eventually here. It's just taking up too much of the budget right now. You got to make it. But I didn't hear the word revenue mentioned. And I didn't hear about taxes. And I know Andrew will talk in a little bit that more money was on the table in prior conversations than there is now. I don't see how this thing gets resolved. I just think there's so much daylight between both parties on this. The president disincentivized to negotiate with himself. Republicans know if they give an inch and they offer up any more, even closing loopholes like they're talking about before, they're going to be looking at a primary the next time they're up for election. I don't see how this thing ends pleasantly.
I think you're getting a little apocalyptic right now myself. I mean, look, since 2011, we've plugged about $2.5 trillion out of this deficit. It's been about 2/3 spending cuts, 1/3 revenues. You know, it's been messy, it's been ugly, but we're sort of stumbling in the right direction. And if you look at the markets, you look at business, I think there's a sense of not complacency, but they're okay with it. And you see that reflected in the S&P right now. Look, as a business guy, I hate to see cuts when I see them in business and they cut, out of R&D and things like that. Yeah, you're not going to see Les Miserables on the streets when that happens, but it is a dumb cut, like you said, and over time it will impact.
And this is one thing. Every businessman knows if you have to, you can cut 1 to 4 to 5%.
I think the American people understand that too.
And in the end, you can still run a business. Maybe they didn't do it as artfully as this, but is that the Republicans' point to say, hey, at the end of the day, we're talking about $80-something billion out of a $4 trillion budget. This is a rounding number. We should be able to do this. Are they more right than wrong or no?
Look, we had big tax increases at the start of the year, and the Republicans said, apocalypse, my God, what's going to happen? We had the greatest January in the history of the S&P. Now we've got these spending cuts, 1, 2, 3% over the next year and a half or so. We can adjust those, fine-tune them, and I think, again, the business community and the jobs community is going to take it in stride that we're slowly headed in the right direction. Your bigger point is we missed the vote on entitlements, and I think that's where both sides are disappointed.